Winter doesn't kill from the sky. Winter has never needed drama to be lethal. No roaring blizzards, no cinematic whiteouts. It kills quietly, slowly, and almost always from the ground up. Here is the mistake most civilizations made in cold climates. They looked up. They reinforced roofs. They thickened walls. They built bigger fires and burned more fuel, believing the enemy was the air around them. The Vikings noticed something different. They saw that cold did not arrive loudly. It crept in through contact, through damp soil, through frozen earth, through the surface people stood on, slept on, and rested against for hours at a time. Long before physics had language for it, they understood a simple truth. The ground steals heat faster than wind ever can. That realization changed how they built everything. Scandinavia was not forgiving land. Winters were long, forests finite, and firewood expensive in labor and time. A society that depended on constant flames would eventually strip its own environment bare. The Vikings could not afford that. So instead of asking how to make bigger fires, they asked a more dangerous question. What if fire isn't the real solution? What if survival depends not on generating more heat, but on losing less of it? This is where the Viking longhouse stops being a shelter and starts becoming a machine. To modern eyes, the floor of a longhouse looks unremarkable. Earthy, rustic, almost primitive. But that appearance hides intent. The Vikings did not treat the floor as a surface you walked on. They treated it as the first line of defense. They understood that warmth lost downward was almost impossible to recover. Once heat bled into frozen ground, it was gone. No wall thickness could compensate for that loss. No roof could fix it. So they attacked the problem at its source. They redesigned the relationship between humans and the earth itself. Archaeological evidence across Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and the British Isles shows the same pattern repeated again and again. These were not regional quirks or lucky accidents. They were standardized decisions, refined over generations. The Viking floor was layered, elevated, breathable, adjustable. And most importantly, it continued working after the fire went out. That is the part most people miss. Viking homes were not kept warm by constant burning through the night. That would have been wasteful and dangerous. Smoke build-up, fire risk, fuel exhaustion. Instead, warmth was stored earlier, then released slowly when it mattered most, during sleep, when the body is most vulnerable to cold. This was not folklore. It was environmental engineering, driven by survival pressure. Modern construction, for all its materials and technology, often fails here. Concrete slabs sit directly on the earth, acting like massive cold plates. Floors are sealed so tightly that moisture has nowhere to escape. Heating systems warm air that immediately rises, away from the body. The Vikings solved this without equations or machines. They solved it by paying attention to what killed people quietly. Cold children, lingering illness, weak mornings after damp nights. These were data points. Failures taught them what worked and what didn't. Floors that drained life were rebuilt. Materials that trapped moisture were removed. Designs that preserved warmth spread from settlement to settlement. Over time, something remarkable emerged. A floor that didn't just support a home, but protected life itself. And it began with one counterintuitive decision that most people would never think to make. The most dangerous contact, the most lethal mistake in a cold climate, is not exposure to wind. It is contact with the ground. Frozen earth behaves like a silent predator. It absorbs heat endlessly, without noise, without warning. Anything resting directly on it loses warmth hour by hour, not dramatically, but fatally. The Vikings learned this lesson the hard way, long before anyone could explain it with diagrams or formulas. Homes built too low became damp. Floors pressed against soil stayed cold even when fires burned all day. People woke weaker than they went to sleep. So the Vikings did something deceptively simple. They lifted the floor, not high enough to show off, not enough to look defensive, just enough to break contact. Most Viking longhouses were raised only 10 to 40 centimeters above the ground. To a modern observer, that gap looks insignificant, but thermally, it changed everything. That small elevation severed the direct pathway through which cold and moisture climbed upward. The ground could no longer touch the living space. And when that connection was broken, the rules changed. The space beneath the floor became a buffer zone, dry, stable, and far less affected by freezing temperatures. Moisture drained away instead of rising. Cold air no longer had a direct conduit into the home. Heat stopped vanishing into the earth below. This decision alone transformed survival odds. But the Vikings didn't stop there. Beneath the raised floor, they built a layered foundation designed not to fight nature, but to control it. The lowest layer was gravel, loose, porous, and resistant to frost. Meltwater drained downward. Ice struggled to form. The soil beneath stayed less aggressive, less hostile. Above the gravel came sand. Simple, unassuming, but critical. Sand leveled the surface and distributed pressure evenly. More importantly, it spread heat slowly instead of allowing sharp temperature differences to form across the floor. Then came stone. Not random stones, chosen ones. Dense rocks like granite were placed deliberately within the subfloor. These stones had one job: store heat. When the hearth burned in the evening, they absorbed warmth slowly. When the fire died, they gave it back just as slowly, releasing heat upward through the night. Archaeologists know this wasn't accidental. Excavations across Scandinavia reveal stones cracked by repeated heating and cooling, a signature of intentional thermal use. Discoloration from long-term exposure to warmth appears again and again beneath longhouse floors. In some sites, thin ash layers beneath stones suggest they were heated deliberately before placement. This was not decoration, it was design. Together, elevation, gravel, sand, and stone formed a system that behaved like a thermal reservoir. Heat went in when fuel was available. Heat came out when fuel was scarce. And crucially, nothing was sealed airtight. The Vikings understood something many modern buildings ignore. Moisture trapped is moisture weaponized. Their floors breathed, air moved, dampness escaped. The system tolerated seasonal change instead of cracking under it. Rigid floors failed, flexible ones survived. This is why the Viking solution spread. Settlements copied what worked. Builders repeated patterns that kept families alive. Over generations, the method became instinctive, not written down, but inherited. By lifting the floor and controlling what lay beneath it, Viking homes gained something fire alone could never provide. Time. Time before cold returned. Time before bodies weakened. Time before winter took its quiet toll. But stone and elevation were only half the story, because a warm foundation means nothing if the living surface above it steals heat back just as efficiently. The living layer stone can store heat, but it cannot protect the body on its own. Above the mineral foundation, the Vikings added something just as important as stone, but far less permanent: a living layer. Organic materials that could insulate without suffocating, warm without trapping moisture, and change as the seasons demanded. This is where the Viking floor stopped being structural and became adaptive. The primary material was straw, not because it was cheap or available, but because it behaved in exactly the right way. Straw is hollow. Each stem traps pockets of air, slowing heat transfer while remaining breathable. Warmth lingers, moisture escapes. The floor stays dry. Raids and rushes were added in coastal and marshy regions. Their waxy outer surfaces resisted dampness, shedding moisture that would otherwise chill the living space. In colder areas, raw wool appeared. Not often, but deliberately. Wool insulates even when wet and resists decay far better than most natural fibers. None of these layers were permanent. That was the point. Viking floors were rebuilt seasonally. In winter, families thickened the organic layer, doubling straw, adding reed mats, reinforcing insulation where people slept. In warmer months, portions were removed to let air move freely, preventing humidity from stagnating beneath the floor. This was modular insulation, centuries before the concept existed. Modern buildings lock insulation into place and hope it works year-round. The Vikings expected change. Their floors adjusted as the environment shifted. What protected against frost in January could become a liability in July if left untouched. This flexibility mattered. Cold kills faster in damp spaces than in dry ones. Moisture steals heat, weakens materials, and breeds illness. The Viking system prioritized breathability above everything else. Nothing was sealed so tightly that water had nowhere to go. Above the organic layer came thin wooden planks. To modern builders, these boards look flimsy, too narrow, too light. But their thinness was intentional. Thick, rigid boards crack when humidity swings violently. And in the north, those swings are extreme. Thin planks flex, they move. They allow vapor to rise and escape. The wood itself came from slow-grown pine and spruce, trees that spent decades developing dense fibers in cold climates. That density made the boards naturally resistant to heat loss, and far more durable than their appearance suggests. Together, these elements formed a floor that breathed. Moist air rose gently through the wood. Insulation stayed dry. Heat, released from the stones below, spread upward without being trapped or lost abruptly. The system didn't fight nature. It negotiated with it. And this produced a counterintuitive result. The warmest air in a Viking longhouse stayed low. Instead of heating useless ceiling space, warmth concentrated near the floor, exactly where people slept, worked, and rested. Children curled close to the ground. Adults sat and ate where residual heat lingered longest. The body stayed warm even as the air higher up cooled. This contradicts many modern heating strategies, which prioritize air temperature rather than contact temperature. The Vikings understood something essential. Comfort is not measured by the air around you, but by the surfaces touching your body. This living floor held warmth long after flames died. It reduced fuel consumption. It lowered smoke output. It made winter survivable without constant burning. But the floor did not work in isolation. It was part of something larger, a closed system that extended upward into the walls and the roof, turning the entire longhouse into a passive heating engine. A house that held the night by itself. The Viking floor was impressive, but it was never meant to work alone. It was designed as part of a closed system, one that managed heat, moisture, and time itself. To understand why Viking homes endured winters that erased other settlements, you have to stop thinking in parts and start thinking in flow. Heat entered the house through fire, but it did not leave the house quickly. The walls were the first restraint. Viking longhouse walls were built from slow-grown pine and spruce, timber formed over decades in harsh climates. These trees grew dense, tight growth rings that resisted rapid heat transfer. Unlike lighter modern woods or synthetic walls, they did not leak warmth quickly. They stabilized interior temperature, smoothing out sudden drops that exhaust the human body. Above those walls sat one of the most misunderstood elements of Viking design: the turf roof. Layer upon layer of soil, grass, and interwoven roots were stacked thick, sometimes more than half a meter deep. To modern eyes, this looks crude. In reality, it was insulation on a massive scale. Turf absorbed heat during the day, resisted wind penetration, and sealed warm air inside the structure. And here is the crucial detail most people miss. Warm air rises, but only if it can escape. The turf roof did not let it. As heat collected beneath the ceiling, it pressed downward, pooling near the floor. This reversed what most people expect. The warmest zone of the house was not at head height, it was near the ground, exactly where people slept. This is where the Viking floor completed the circuit. Heat from the hearth entered the stone beneath the floor earlier in the evening. As the fire died, those stones released warmth upward. The organic layers slowed its escape. The wooden planks guided it gently into the living space. The turf roof trapped it from above. The result was a home that stayed warm without active heating. Not hot, not luxurious, but stable. Stability is what keeps people alive. Archaeological reconstructions confirm this effect. Experimental longhouses built using Viking methods show far slower heat loss than many modern cabins of similar size. Even after fires are extinguished, interior temperatures decline gradually instead of collapsing. This is why turf houses in Iceland remained in use into the 20th century. The technology did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because industrial materials replaced patience. Modern architecture often does the opposite of what the Vikings learned. Concrete slabs sit directly on frozen ground, draining heat relentlessly. Vapor barriers are placed, incorrectly, trapping moisture inside floors. Insulation is focused upward, walls and ceilings, while the most dangerous direction of heat loss is ignored. The result is a house that looks strong on paper, but performs poorly in winter. The Viking house did not rely on machinery. It relied on sequence: heat first, storage second, release third. Retention always. Nothing was airtight. Nothing was rigid beyond necessity. Every material had a role, and every role was shaped by climate rather than convenience. This is why the system lasted. It could be repaired with local materials. Straw could be replaced. Planks could be lifted. Stones could be reheated. Knowledge passed from parent to child, without blueprints or codes. The Viking floor was not a trick. It was not a hack. It was not accidental. It was a solution refined by generations who paid attention to what killed them quietly and removed it from their lives. 1,000 years later, the lesson remains uncomfortable. We did not forget how to build warm homes. We forgot where warmth is actually lost. And if the past teaches us anything, it's this: the most important part of a shelter is not what you build upward, but what you build beneath your feet. Because winter does not attack loudly. It waits. What the Vikings actually solved. The Vikings did not defeat winter with fire. They defeated it with restraint. They understood that heat is precious not because it is hard to create, but because it is easy to lose. And once it is gone, once it sinks into frozen earth or damp materials, no amount of effort can bring it back quickly enough to matter. So they stopped chasing warmth upward. They stopped wasting fuel. They stopped fighting symptoms. Instead, They built systems that held what little warmth they had. A raised floor to break contact with the ground, stone to store heat slowly, organic layers to insulate without trapping moisture, wood that breathed, walls that stabilized, a roof that pressed warmth back down where people lived. Nothing dramatic, nothing excessive, just an honest response to a hostile environment. That is why Viking homes endured, not because they were advanced, but because they were aligned with reality. Every layer answered a specific threat. Every material earned its place. Nothing existed without purpose. Modern buildings often look stronger, thicker, more complex. But complexity does not guarantee resilience. When systems ignore how heat actually moves, they fail quietly, just as winter kills quietly. The Viking floor reminds us of something uncomfortable. Survival is not about technology. It is about attention. Attention to where warmth escapes. Attention to moisture before it becomes deadly. Attention to time. How long a home can protect life after the fire goes out. The Vikings paid that attention because they had no choice. And in doing so, they left behind a lesson that still works, not buried in myth, not locked in legend, but underfoot, where winter has always been waiting.